Hey, so I wanted to share a little bit that I've been learning about trauma lately. Some of you may know that I've just completed a trauma awareness course for facilitators, and I'm also studying sex, love, relationship coaching with Layla Martin, which also covers a lot about trauma healing, safety, and all that kind of good stuff. And I'm currently reading the book The Body Keeps the Score, which is by one of the world's best trauma experts. So I've been learning a lot about it, and I just find it really interesting how different what most of us think is trauma compared to what it actually is, and how pretty much everyone is living with some kind of residual trauma. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about what I've been learning so far, because I think it helps people a lot, and maybe encourage people to do their own research, dive in a little bit deeper as well, because, this is really like, when it comes down to it, trauma is responsible for pretty much everything bad that's happening in the world. All of our own issues, all of our own problems, depression, anxiety, pretty much everything comes down to some form of trauma and trauma cycles. I think it's really interesting that it's something that we don't really learn that much about unless you go out of your way to learn about it. So the first interesting thing I found is that, a lot of the time when we think of trauma, we think of like PTSD, like really extreme things that happen, like people that have a really traumatic experience, seeing people die, or sexual abuse, or stuff that's like really full on. And obviously that is, one of the main types of trauma, especially the types that people go get help for. But actually, we call this big T trauma, and there's little t trauma, which is the things that kind of accumulate day to day, which also leave an effect. So trauma is actually the effect on the nervous system from life events. So if something happened to you, even if it doesn't seem like that big a deal, if it's leaving you feeling unsafe and anxious, then it's, leaving some form of trauma on your body. And most of us day to day, being raised in a society that tells us so many mixed things, makes us feel bad about ourselves, being in situations where we don't feel fully safe, fully loved, don't feel like we belong. This actually keeps adding more and more layers of trauma, which then, slowly affects the nervous system. So, they say that we have a kind of window of tolerance, which is a space in which we can function quite normally, where, if something happens that's mildly inconvenient, we'll be like, oh, that's inconvenient, whatever. And then outside the window of tolerance, you have like hyperarousal, if you're feeling really anxious, stressed, angry, and hypoarousal, which is when you're feeling really depressed and shut down in a sort of freeze response. So sometimes, especially if we are being affected by trauma, our window of tolerance will really shrink, and we'll very easily be going out of that window into hyper or hypoarousal. So a lot of people with depression and anxiety will definitely be feeling this, that they're constantly being triggered by things, constantly getting stressed, like a small thing happens and suddenly it's a really big deal. And a lot of the time, like, in your cortical mind, like, that it's irrational, but you can't help it. That's just the way that your nervous system is reacting to said situation. Obviously it can be frustrating for other people interacting with people whose window of tolerance is small, because, they're easily, like, any small thing that you do can be a big trigger for them. That's an interesting thing, because I found last year my window of tolerance was really small. And that's when, now researching this, I've really found that having chronic illness had left a trauma with me, where I was, constantly, I didn't feel safe in my body. I didn't trust that I was actually better. And I was, as well as like other relationship issues and things like that had been happening, but mostly because of the illness. It just left me in this kind of constantly not feeling safe, constantly on guard, easily going between being, completely like having no motivation to do anything, total hypoarousal, just like laying in bed feeling completely dead to the world, or being a total anxious mess, or getting frustrated really easily. So, yeah, what helps people with trauma to be able to be more resilient and to be able to live in the world in a better way is feeling safe and loved and belonging, which, sounds like, I know, a little bit, softer, like, oh, they need like hardcore therapy. But actually, yeah, a lot of the therapy is about creating this internal sense of safety, belonging, and love that is necessary for us to be able to soothe our nervous system and to be able to hold ourselves in the world without feeling this stress. Because, yeah, so we talk about like fight, flight, freeze. And a new debatable one is fawn, which a lot of us are finding. So obviously, yeah, so what happens with trauma in the nervous system and the primal brain is that, like, if there's some kind of danger that feels like a threat to your primal mind, that feels like a threat to your life and your safety, then your body is going to have a response. And a lot of the time we shut off this response because, we have to go to work, we have to like live in the world, it's not appropriate to freak out. So we put the lid on the emotion, we cut it off, and we don't actually express it. And then this traps the trauma into our system. So if you get triggered by something that brings out the fight response, which is like, when there's some kind of threat to you and your nervous system and your primal brain is just like, I need to fight off this threat, then, this is usually where you feel like frustrated and angry and aggressive. So what you need to do is complete that stress response cycle, which is why, people recommend like doing some heavy lifting, exercise, punching pillows, screaming, something to complete that cycle. And there's also flee, which is, a lot of anxiety where you just want to run away from things, you want to get out of there. And to complete that cycle, you need to go for a run or do some kind of activity. So they've actually found in people that have been in natural disasters, for example, if they were able to run away from the threat and from the disaster, then they often have a much easier time integrating and processing what happened to them, and they're not left with so much trauma compared to people that were maybe strapped down or put in somewhere where they couldn't move while the trauma was happening. And if they were stuck in one place, then that traps the trauma in their body, and that usually is what creates PTSD. So not being able to like get away or fight away. Which also comes down to freeze. And this is also a common thing for a lot of sexual trauma, is that the brain will have the freeze response, which is when there's a threat and your primal brain says like, I can't fight or run away, so the safest thing to do is to just disconnect and numb out. And this is going to keep you somewhat safe, where you're going to kind of dissociate from your body. And then if it was a life or death situation, then it would be kind of less painful. So then the freeze response comes in, and this one is one of the most frustrating because it's quite hard to kind of complete that stress cycle for a lot of people when you freeze, and it can cause some of the most like internal damage. And what animals in the wild do after they've been stuck in freeze is to shake. And to like shake out is actually the natural response, what humans should be doing after a situation. So personally, I've been doing a lot of work that involves shaking, including, during breath work, doing shaking. And it's really amazing how sometimes past memories come up and then you shake them literally out of your system. And it's a kind of hard thing to describe unless you feel it yourself. But it does feel natural, and now it comes more naturally to me. Like recently I witnessed a scooter crash, and the first thing I did after helping the people was just like shake it out, and it just feels natural now that I've learned that and that I have practiced that. Fawn is a new one that because we say that humans are tribal creatures, and also when you're young, you're very reliant on your mother and father and your caregivers to take care of you. So being ostracized from people and being kind of rejected from your tribe in your primal brain brings up a fear of death, which creates trauma. So if you feel like you're going to be rejected from your tribe, or your caregivers are going to leave you and you're going to be unloved, then this can actually create the feeling of I'm going to die in your system. Even though in your logical mind you might know like, oh, I'm not going to die, it's just bullying, it's just, you know, whatever. But actually deep down in your primal brain, it is creating a trauma a lot of the time. So yeah, this is where fawn often comes in as well, which is this people pleasing, like this need to be loved and to, you know, totally neglect your own boundaries to please people so that they're not going to leave you, they're not going to reject you, so you're going to be safe. And this often, involves people just totally disrespecting themselves and doing whatever other people want because they're so scared of being abandoned or left alone, because this equals death in their mind. Subconscious mind, obviously, not consciously for a lot of people. So yeah, that's a new one that's not as recognized, but, you know, is getting a lot of notice as being very relevant for a lot of people. So yeah, there's a lot of resourcing tools that people can use to create their own internal sense of safety and love and belonging, because the reality is the outside world isn't always going to be there for you. So there's ways for you to like soothe your own nervous system and fill yourself up with all this love. And that's a lot of the work that I've been doing, especially in relation to sexuality, because your sexuality is sort of the gatekeeper. It's, you know, it's life and death. It's the core of who we are as human beings, and it's the core of a lot of core woundings, shadows, and traumas. A lot of that is held in our sexuality. So doing a lot of work with feeling self-love, self-pleasure, working with our sexuality to like love our bodies and love ourselves is actually very core to healing a lot of trauma and getting out of trauma cycles. It's really important when you're noticing that other people are in a trauma response and being easily triggered, is to not take it personally and to just get curious about it and to be open-minded for the fact that, you know, just because even if you do know someone and maybe you know that they haven't had some like really hardcore history of a really bad trauma or abuse that sticks out, that doesn't mean that they're not affected by trauma in their system, which can come from, even just things like being bullied or having negative parents that talk down to them, or any kind of things, living in a society that tells them that they should be ashamed of their sexuality or ashamed of their bodies. There's so many things. Pretty much everyone has some kind of trauma that's like holding them back and keeping things inside them. Another interesting thing that I found for myself, which is like a type of trauma response, is the kind of addiction to extremes and addiction to stress. So for a lot of us, if we had a lot of stress in our upbringing, really busy parents and, this kind of push to like really be good at school and do lots of extracurricular things, then our system gets addicted to the stress hormones and to being in a state of stress. So a lot of the last year for me has been about really recognizing this kind of addiction to stress and addiction to extremes, and really wanting to like push myself all the time and to have breakthroughs, even in yoga, like I was doing Ashtanga, wanting to do like, the hardcore kind of stuff. That was my system being addicted to always being in a sympathetic nervous system. And so now I've been doing a lot of practices that are about parasympathetic yin practices, going inwards, being really gentle. And, actually that is a new type of extreme for me, is, instead of being so outward and so, wanting to be stressed and doing all the things, it's sort of, all right, how much inwards can I go? How relaxed can I be? And this is where actually doing free diving recently was interesting, because it was sort of linked to a lot of this trauma stuff and being in a parasympathetic state, and that, to do it best. You have to be the calmest and the most peaceful and not stress at all. And, I wouldn't have been able to do free diving a year or two ago when I was super stressy all the time. But now that I've got better at going inwards and being a lot more peaceful and calming down my nervous system, then it came a lot easier for me. So another thing about healing trauma is obviously consent and, people learning boundaries, which is a lot of the work that I do, because a lot of people really struggle with boundaries, especially if they're in this fawn kind of response. And a lot of us have trauma around a lack of consent and people touching us without our permission. And it's really important to be aware of, that other people are more sensitive than we are because of their past traumas. So one reason I really love doing this trauma awareness course for facilitators is that, I'm not as sensitive, especially, I've worked in the adult industry and I'm used to being around people and, even sadly used to people touching me without consent. And I, can get into like the fight, angry woman pretty easy and protect my boundaries, but a lot of other people can't. So it was really interesting to see how, as a facilitator, it's really important for me to be aware of other people's trauma and to be a lot more clear with consent and boundaries, and to really empower people and create really as safe a space as possible so that people that do have trauma can really feel like they can be there, feel like they can do the work. And a lot of the work also is about, people can only really heal and integrate things when they feel safe. If you're constantly in a, unsafe, unsure, kind of stressful environment, then your nervous system never really fully integrates any kind of healing you do. So you can be doing all these workshops and healings and, even breath work and stuff. But if you're not actually calming down the nervous system, if you're not actually feeling safe, then it doesn't actually really do anything. So that was a big problem of mine last year. I was doing a lot of workshops and a lot of healing, but I still wasn't trusting my body and feeling safe in my body after being sick for so long. So it wasn't really settling in there. And it was only after doing a really powerful breath work and really seeing those kind of things from a different perspective and feeling safe that I was able to really start integrating pieces and healing. And power dynamics are also a really important part of understanding trauma. Another amazing thing in the course, there was like the best interview ever with Layla Martin and Shelby about sexual abuse, power dynamics, sexual projections. And I seriously recommend anyone that's working in sexuality or in general, any teachers, invest in this course and watch this interview, because she says it way better than I could possibly reiterate. But people, especially if you were abused by like an authority figure, it's very common to like seek out authority figures and want to seduce them and be loved by them. And so it's really important to understand how that happens and not let things get to your head that people project so much on you. And it's really important to re-empower people in their own healing to, see when they're projecting onto you as being this savior or this high and mighty person that's here to fix their problems, and to give that power back to them. Like we all do our own healing. People can give you tools and help guide you, but the healing comes from within. Same with your own internal energy source, your own magic, etc. It's all in you. And having someone that can hold a good space and guide you safely is, the ideal kind of situation, but it's easy for people to project that. And another thing is about going to the edge but not over, which was interesting as well. And something that I had been doing was going over my edge and feeling like, I really need to put myself out there and really try things, especially with like touch and other people, going to workshops and being like, okay, if I have an issue with this, I really need to like just go over my edge and try to like break through. But that's actually part of a trauma pattern and isn't actually going to help. You just re-traumatize yourself a lot of the time. So yeah, we want people to be in a space where they're feeling like they can safely go to their edge and see how that feels, and then integrate it and sort of keep bouncing between that and going just slowly and gently. And that is a way that's actually going to cause healing, because if people go over their edge and get re-triggered and re-traumatized, then it just prolongs their healing time, because then that's just an extra layer that's going to be put on, and a lot of the time that will then create resistance from people going back and getting more help, going to more workshops, going to more coaching or therapy if they're being re-traumatized, because then they know that it's a risky thing, that if they go do this breath work or they go see this coach, that there's a risk that they're going to go over their edge. So that's going to create enough resistance that they're not going to want to, and their protection, their primal brain protection, is going to straight away put up alarm bells and be like, no, it's not safe. And we've seen this a lot with people that have gone to tantra workshops that weren't run by people that were very aware of this kind of stuff, and they've been re-traumatized. And then often that comes out as like a really hardcore shadow or aggression, and being really, really anti that work, which is understandable, but not how it's working for everyone else. And that's, certain teachers, certain people do abuse power and are doing some pretty dodgy shit. And yeah, but that doesn't mean that all the work is bad. It's just, there's good and bad people in everything. And that's why it's really important for people to have good boundaries and be aware of their projections and their stuff, so that they can really discern who is a good teacher, who's a bad teacher. Do they really want to be doing this thing? Should they leave? And that kind of thing. And yeah, as for trauma healing type thing, so yeah, like coaches, like this course I'm doing, it's some really powerful, amazing work. Obviously, going and seeing like more like a spiritual coach or someone that's doing kind of work with trauma is more for people with little t trauma, residual trauma, or people that have really worked on their bigger traumas enough that then they're feeling ready to sort of integrate it all and go slower. If people have like full PTSD, obviously, psychotherapy and more intense therapy is often needed, and often is something people don't take until it's quite late, and until the thing is, like, your neural pathways, every time you're reacting to things, are then ingraining it more and more. So the longer you take after a traumatic event to get help, the more your neural pathways start really strengthening into this reality and these triggers and stuff. So the earlier you can deal with an issue, so if something comes up in the future that is traumatic, it is really important to try to get help as soon as possible, so that you can complete the stress response cycle and you can start the integration and healing process before it really ingrains in your brain and really strengthens there. So for me, yeah, breath work has been amazing. The amazing tool that I found last year that has made a huge difference in my life. There's people doing all kinds of breathwork ceremonies, breathwork journeys, private breathwork sessions. And yeah, I've been training to be doing private breathwork sessions with people too, because it's honestly the best thing that I've found. And also, if you're someone that gets stuck in freeze a lot, then TRE, tremor kind of work, especially with breath work, is really amazing. Doing this kind of forced shaking that then turns into a natural shake and can help move blockages and trauma from your nervous system. There's also so many different things out there for this, so it's definitely worth investing in and really looking into. I find so many of us just are happy to spend a lot of our money going to music festivals or spending it on drinking, etc. And honestly, the best thing I've ever done is spend all of my money on studying this stuff, learning this stuff, going to workshops, really reprogramming a lot of my habits and parts of me. And, you know, I'm so much happier now. I used to be a very depressed person. I've had severe anxiety attacks and all kinds of things over the year, chronic illness. And, you know, since I've been doing this work, I'm honestly so much happier and healthier, more in touch with my body. And yeah, I think it's really possible for everyone to, you know, eventually move on from all these blockages and all this shit. But it's not easy. It's a hard process. It's a long process. It's a lifetime process, really. But it's one of the best things you could ever do for yourself. So yeah, if this stuff all sounded really interesting to you, if it resonated, then yeah, look more into it. You know, hit me up. We can chat about it. I can connect people with amazing coaches and therapists. You know, I'm still studying coaching. I do some coaching on some lighter subjects, not trauma work at the moment, but I know some really amazing people in the field. So I'm happy to connect people with them. So yeah, thanks for watching. I now have a Patreon where I'm going to be putting up videos and some practices related to this sort of safety, integration, self-love, etc. So if you're interested, then check out my Patreon, and there'll be a lot more goodness like this to come in the following months and years. Thank you. Bye.